thought would be interesting to put up here for a reason, because I think it speaks to um, a bit of a question that I have for you guys this week, which you'll see in your weekly checklist for this week's journals. So, one thing I think that starts to emerge from this week's Barash readings is a sense in which we might want to push on, I guess, some of the ideas that were proposed in Kissinger and the other folks we were reading last week, who loosely talked about building institutions, building ways of creating space for dialogue, but they didn't really address the question of how those institutions could be built internationally, and they didn't address the question of how those institutions could be made to last. Now, before we go any further, I want to put it to you that whether you agree that it is possible or not to build enduring institutions of global government or governance, I think it honestly depends on where you stand on the question of culture. Previously, you'll recall we've talked about Michael Howard, who says that our problem is not at all to do with human nature, as others would put it, Freud, I think, specifically, but rather the system within which nation states find themselves. And of course, we've talked about that a couple of weeks ago as the system of anarchy. Now, some will take this further, as people like John Locke did, and we'll have more to say about John Locke in a moment. But they say that the problem is one simply to do with communication. And because the system, is a system that exists and is flawed only by virtue of its lack of communication, then communication sort of is the obvious fix, right? But others will say, not so fast. And while communication matters, certainly, another sticking point is culture, and we might have cultural disagreements with each other. So it is only through cultural change that we can really accomplish anything as ambitious as world government. Now, culture, why do you think culture matters? Well, it's just interesting. There's been a couple of studies on shipping disasters, and one thing that's really been identified about how people behave during shipping disasters is that their culture matters, right? The Titanic, as you know, didn't have enough lifeboats, but they have done some interesting work on this and found out that if you're American, you're actually more likely to survive a shipping accident than if you are British. And one of the explanatory factors there is that British people tend to follow the rules. So they tend to line up, and they, in a situation like the Titanic, where there aren't enough lifeboats, that means that British people may end up getting left in the line waiting for a lifeboat that's never going to come. Americans, being more individualistic and having a sort of a stronger survival impulse in that sense, perhaps arguably, if you want to go there, being more selfish, tend to survive situations like this better, even when there aren't enough lifeboats, because they are willing to push and shove their way to the front. So, that's some Australian research that I saw a couple of years ago. But it's very, very interesting for us in terms not to, the point here is not to insult anyone. It's just to draw attention to the fact that culture changes how people behave. So if you, want to create peace through global government, then having everyone on the same page in terms of culture and respecting the rules of law and order is going to be a huge, huge factor. So as your Barash chapter argues, it's not exactly easy to propose world government, right? Because these the stereotype of what it means to speak about government in our heads is one that would typically involve some sort of sovereignty, right? And sovereignty, as we know, is connected to the ability to project some kind of force. The only body historically that's ever existed, really, with the power to project force globally, is the United Nations. And even then, it doesn't really look like the United Nations has sovereignty, because there are five, at least, permanent members of the Security Council. There's more that rotate, but there's five permanent members of the Security Council. They are the most powerful states on Earth, and each one of them has a veto over the force that can be deployed by the United Nations. So, in that sense, there's very little, sense in arguing that the UN is anything like a global government or a world government. No matter how much X-Files you might watch, or conspiracy theories you might read about the existence of a global government, the closest thing we actually have to one is the UN, and even that's very, very far from being a world government. Instead, it's a talking shop, right? It's a place where nations can come together to debate their issues and argue about their issues, and occasionally, if there's collaboration among them and agreement by those on the Security Council, there can be some military action, but not in a way that would imply that the UN has its own power to decide when it's appropriate to use force or not. Instead, it's actually the states that decide when a force should be used. So if that's the case, and we don't really have these sovereign entities, then why do we have international institutions at all? That's a great question. They don't seem to do anything other than cover up or plaster over what's already existing as a structure of international relations. Well, that's an interesting question. So if we can agree that there's something like a win-win situation to be gained from maintaining these institutions, say for communicating with each other and various other purposes, then obviously, while they may not have sovereignty, there might be other ways in which they are in fact powerful and useful. And they allow us to get certain things done. And among those things would be, for example, the ability to create standards in global trading, the ability to ideally do things about global environmental issues like the greenhouse gas emissions, where global institutions of governance were very important, and without which we might not have had an agreement about what we should do about greenhouse gases. Not greenhouse gases, excuse me, the ozone hole is what I meant to say. Greenhouse gases is something we are still very much working on. So it is clear that international organizations have some potential as mechanisms for information exchange and as venues for debating our common concerns. But there's also, I think, some corruption, and there's also, I think, the fact that dominant nation states sort of can abuse their position within these institutions, like the IMF, the World Bank. Clearly are international organizations that will tend to represent the interests of the rich, powerful states as they go about their job of trying to help development around the world. So the record is mixed on whether international organizations are successful or not. And I think that's perhaps why Barash quotes Freud's letter that we read. Remember the letter to Einstein? He brings that up again in his essay, and talks about the international organizations as sort of conjuring up images of, and I quote, mills that grind so slowly that before the flour is ready, men are dead of hunger. Are alternatively expressed in the words of the economist John Maynard Keynes, in the long run, we're all dead. So, culture definitely matters in terms of building these institutions, but at the end of the day, we're still not so far along with them that they have necessarily provided outstanding service to us. So the jury is still out, I would argue. But before we get too cynical, I think it's important to try to understand some of the debates about how global institutions should be run and what their potential is. So one of the really nice things about this Barash piece is the rich genealogy, the rich family tree, if you will, of theories of government that it speaks to. We have, for example, a discussion of the origins of left-wing thinking on the subject in the form of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's commentary. But I want to leave that aside myself, because I think the folks, the main show in town here is that of liberalism, and that's why we should probably start with John Locke. As Barash puts it, a Lockean, which is our adjective for John Locke, right? A Lockean model of world government is a vision largely based on mutual consent. So it's a horizontal model. It implies all nation states are effectively equal to each other, functionally speaking. Some people describe this as a billiard ball model. It doesn't ask the question of what the nation states are like inside their borders. It doesn't ask whether they're dictatorships or democracies. It just simply sort of makes a nation state equivalent to a human being, equivalent to a person, gives it sort of its own corporeal intentionality, instrumentalized notion of its own interests, and sort of builds a system not unlike that described by Howard. So it's kind of impersonal in the sense that the actual literal human beings aren't so present in there. So and in this sense, Locke as an early sort of liberal, because of his kind of what some people call an atomistic perspective, or an economistic perspective, is sort of held up as a sort of an early classical liberal thinker. He's often contrasted with the likes of Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes, as you may have studied in other classes, had a view of human nature that was quite negative. And he argued that life in the state of nature was what he called a zero-sum game. That is to say, if I win, you lose. If I have one more spear, you have effectively, in real terms, one less spear than I do, so that makes you insecure, right? If I have two guns and you only have a knife, you should feel pretty insecure. So my gain in security is your loss in security. It's a pie, and if I take a bigger slice of pie, you have less pie left for you. So in that sense, a zero-sum game sort of version of the world, which is the version of the world that people like Thomas Hobbes were articulating, is that order is going to be impossible without some sort of very powerful government. The stakes are just too high. And of course, the problem is, while you can put a government in place in a nation state, to have a government like that internationally is going to be very, very tricky indeed. Now, Locke is a more optimistic thinker than Hobbes, and he had faith in man's natural reason. He had an understanding, as I was trying to say earlier on, kind of like an economistic or atomistic viewpoint, like Hobbes, to be sure, but also believed that largely human beings were rational, and that therefore not only zero-sum games were likely, but also what he called positive-sum games. And what that means is, effectively, in basic common or garden English, is that you don't need an almighty government interfering in your life on a regular basis. Largely, populations want to be left alone to get on with their own affairs, and that means that they're capable of self-government. You can count on them to a certain extent to govern their own behavior. They want live and let live is largely their motto. I don't necessarily need to concern myself with the fact that you have two guns and I have only a knife. If I'm pretty certain that we're all going to just leave each other to our own devices. So this is the question then of the comparison between relative gains, where you have more spears than me, and absolute gains, which is that I can just get on with my life and tend to my fields, work my agriculture, my farm, and basically then the peaceful order will not be an order that is enforced on people by a sort of a Hobbesian dictator, but an order that will be sort of more self-policed by the people because they feel an interest in it, right? They feel it's in their best interests. So in Lockean politics, then, it's more optimistic because people tend to live by the axiom of their own self-limitation. I don't need to go to war unless I have to, and if you're not threatening me, then I don't need to threaten you. So live and let live is the order of the day. But the problem, of course, is that while that's possible to do within the confines of a nation state, where there's a police force and a court to appeal disputes to, which helps remove the temptation to engage to resolve your disputes through conflict. When it comes to international affairs, we still have the problem of how you would enforce law and order, because there isn't a global sovereign. So we still have that problem, the problem of a kind of a lack of coordination, a lack of enforcement at the global level. And so Locke, while he's sort of seen as an early liberal and as having sort of pointed the way towards a win-win situation for everyone to engage in peace in international politics, there's something missing there, and we need to address that. And the person that we normally turn to address that is Immanuel Kant, who described in his famous pamphlet on perpetual peace 3 articles which he believed, if they were pursued, would lead to further democracy. And I want to take a moment to describe this. I'll maybe add a little more detail for you that's not in the Barash text, but focus specifically on the question of culture, which I think is hugely important here, and maybe Barash doesn't emphasize it quite enough in the way that piece is framed. Although you'll find that Steven Pinker actually, I think, without mentioning Kant at all, definitely seems very Kantian in the way he describes things. So our first step towards peace then is democratization, and that's because Kant has a specific sense that the only people that can really be involved in world government are republics. And republics, as you may be aware, are nation states where everyone is considered equal in the law, right? That is to say, there's no king or queen that is outside of the law. Everyone is equally subject to the law. So it doesn't matter who you are. If you break the law, you can be put before court. Now, that's an important development for Kant, because it means that the people who pay the taxes can hold the government to account, okay? And that means they have a say in whether government makes decisions or not. For example, to go to war. Now, no citizen, Kant argues, would rationally want to go to war. War is so expensive in terms of blood and treasure that you only go to war when you have to. So war then is usually something that's pushed on you. Now he asks the question, well, what kind of countries would push you into war? If a republic meets a non-republic, it's possible that that non-republic could be warlike because it still has a king or a queen, and the taxpayers aren't holding that sovereign to account. But when two republics meet, that's a different question, isn't it? Because there you have two situations where there's two countries where the taxpayers have a say in keeping their government accountable to them. So, in that sense, argues Kant, you're much more likely to see those taxpayers prefer not to go to war because they can recognize each in the other a preference for the pen over the sword, so to speak. So Kant argues then that that the democratic nature of states, the societal attitude of the states in their appreciation for democracy makes a big difference. And so that's something that Locke hadn't really described, but it's something certainly Kant is adding to Locke, if you will, that makes a huge amount of difference to the theory. So, yeah, our first step with Kant is to recognize that peace is only possible through democratization. Other nation states, non-democracies, can have peace temporarily, but to build a lasting federation of peace, you need to have democracy. So, and the next step then, once you have that, is to these democracies will realize an advantage in committing to working together over the long term to develop some kind of collective security amongst themselves to defend themselves from the non-republics that are out there. And through these this sort of solidarity pact, if you will, and maybe building up, as we see in point 3 here, universal hospitality, the right of access for freedom of trade, freedom of exchange of goods and services, you start to build up between both of these institutions a sense of trust, a sense of shared values. So now the question is, how is this development of shared values and understandings to be taken as something like a world government, right? It's starting to look a little bit more like the world that we live in, because, of course, we have freedom of trade and we have a lot of collective security that we've negotiated through various organizations, from NATO through to the United Nations. So clearly this is not a sort of a massive all-powerful sovereign in the sense that Thomas Hobbes would have described, but it is what Barash refers to as a minimalist world government, and the point is that it's perhaps by introducing the question of republican democracy that Kant has done something which Locke and others like him didn't do, which is to show how even with only a very lightweight sovereign, that is to say, a set of institutions that have maybe partial sovereignty, that you can make progress towards achieving global peace or order without necessarily going the whole way of creating an actual global state, right, or a global sovereign. And it's through that kind of philosophy, I think, that we've seen the creation of something like the UN. And if you think it doesn't matter, if you think it's not of consequence, then, at the end of the piece, Barash asks the question, can you imagine a war between the United States and Canada? If you're a Lockean, one of the early liberals, then yeah, sure, you could conceivably imagine a situation whereby Canadian concerns might America or Canada might sort of necessarily one of them might necessarily start becoming a bad actor, and in which case one or the other would be worried about relative gains. Again, that spear question. Now, Locke obviously says that 9 times out of 10 that's not going to happen, but it could happen conceivably, and that would be an argument for the United States and Canada both to maintain some kind of modest army, to be ready against each other, to be ready to fight back should the neighbor go a little bit crazy sometime. Whereas Kant would argue that that's just ridiculous, right? That at this stage in their mutual existence and their history as neighbors, Americans and Canadians have come to share fundamental political values, and there's just no way Canada and America could ever go to war again. And in fact, for that reason, there's comedy movies made about the subject. If you haven't seen Canadian Bacon, I solidly recommend it. So that's something to keep in mind as sort of expressing the difference between a Lockean stance on global democracy and global government and a Kantian one. Last but not least, we move on to Steven Pinker. And Pinker, I think, is a good guy to have here because, when he starts talking about these sort of 6 waves, although actually, to be honest with you, reading it, I could only find 5 waves in the piece. So I'm going to go with 5 waves. There's a sense that, there really has been a strong shift over the centuries and millennia in the way human societies have been organized, and that this development of our organizational structure of our institutions has really truly reduced the amount of violence that we meter out on each other. So for Pinker, primitive men are very, very violent, and you're likely to die a violent death in primitive society. I just think it's something to sort of take seriously. Steven Pinker is a well-known psychologist and has made a great name for himself as a neuropsychologist. He's a quite scholarly individual, and I have no reason to doubt his characterization of this period. But what is very interesting, to sort of skip through his description of those various waves, is his description of how the Enlightenment, the long peace, and the new peace, which are the last 3 of these waves, have brought with them new awareness of rights, new awareness of liberties, and have sort of dignified the human being as a creature that's worthy of being sort of treated with a modicum of respect. Whereas previously to the Enlightenment, there wasn't really much of a sense that human beings were any more special than, say, God would will for them to be regarded as. So holy violence, divine punishment, that kind of thing could be metered out by a king or a queen pretty much at will in those previous ages, whereas afterwards, after the Enlightenment, it's very, very hard to have a king or a queen that would do that. They don't have that power anymore. That power has been taken away from them. So there's a lot to this argument, that societies have changed, and so in the light of what we were talking about with Barash beforehand, I think what really sort of concerns us is this question of the so-called new peace, which is roughly synonymous with globalization. Having talked about Kant and the importance of republics and the importance of building sense of each other's hospitality through cosmopolitan networks of communication, all of that was in the Barash piece and with Kant. Pinker's kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of thinking about how that relates to the era that we're living in today, which is roughly synonymous with globalization. Now, to me, that's all very Kantian, but it's sort of updating Kant to think about what Kant looks like in the era of the fax machine, of the internet, and the Twitter account. So in a sense, none of those things were around for Kant, but Pinker's very good at sort of giving us an insight into an argument that would hold that the world has kind of flattened more than Kant would ever have imagined. Our ability to communicate with each other has really taken on unimaginable potential, and we should be very pleased with it because it bodes well, says Pinker, who believes that that it's this very process that ultimately is as power and information verticality has flattened out, that's very good for peace, right? And of course, that sounds very enchanting, but the question we would have, of course, is are there no asymmetries left in this context? We may find that there are, and then the question becomes, well, that there's at least one country in the world that has a very sort of great amount of power compared to all the others, and that is the United States. And I have a little quote here from Woodrow Wilson from 1917, which argues and echoes this sort of famous quote that Wilson had, that he was bringing the United States into World War One, entering World War One, in order to, and I quote, make the world safe for democracy. So this is, and you can read the quote there, our object now as then is to vindicate the principles of peace and justice in the life of the world as against selfish and autocratic power, and to set up amongst the really free and self-governed people of the world such a concert of purpose and action as will henceforth ensure the observance of those principles. So clearly the language of someone who believes in democracy and believes in many of the principles that Kant and Locke are advocating, and Pinker too. But it just remains the question that we don't necessarily, just because we advocate a flatness to the world, just because we advocate democracy in the world, doesn't necessarily mean that power is evenly distributed in the world. So while we move towards a world of globalization where it looks like everything's flat, and it looks like new information technologies and communication technologies have overcome the borders and empowered populations with new democratic potential, it should probably still be recognized that nation states still do have a lot of power, and some of them a lot more than others, and the United States probably more than anyone. So it's important to recognize that the United States plays a decisive and exceptional role in world politics today. And, it's just something of a shame that neither Steven Pinker nor Barash really mentioned that. So, okay, guys, we'll wrap it up here, I think, coming up on the hour marker. So thanks for your time. I hope the class is going well for you. I hope you'll read the checklist. I got some questions in there for you on the readings for this week, and I look very much forward to reading your fine journals soon on David Graeber and Steven Pinker and David Barash. Thank you very much.